Okay, so we are getting ready to start chapter 18. Now, we've discussed it before where, it's always like there's always this tension between wanting to do as much as possible inside and not to skip over any concepts, while at the same time wanting to actually feel like we're making progress in the Tanya. And you could really do both to an extreme, we can do word by word, line by line, and literally spend uh a few lessons on each chapter. We can also do a much more global overview where we do a few chapters in one at once. We try to keep the balance somewhere in the middle. So we're, you know, kind of move along and make progress while still really focusing on about a chapter a week. Sometimes we do more than 1 week on a chapter. I try to cover all the main points of the chapter. Um, Chapter 18, hi Lorraine, we're starting a new idea in the Tanya. Oh, here's Harriet. Okay, great, just in time. We're about to start a new idea, but before we start this new idea, I want to take a moment to a little bit sum up where we are and what we've been talking about. There's a great analogy of a goat and a giraffe who are having a discussion. The goat and the giraffe meet each other outside on a daily basis, and the giraffe can't get over the fact that the goat is always just eating grass, always just looking down and eating grass. And the giraffe's trying to talk to the goat and say, hey, goat, do you know there's like, if only you looked up, there's such amazing stuff out there. Like, have you ever looked up at the sun? Goat's like, I have no idea what you're talking about. All I see is grass. I have my head bent down. And the giraffe says, well, there's like mountains and they're beautiful. And there's all these trees. And the goat says, I can't look up. For me to look up would take so much effort. I'd have to stand on my hind legs. I'd have to twist my neck. It really would be so difficult. Maybe if you gave me a really good reason to look up, then I could try, but I'm not really convinced I should look there. And the giraffe says, well, I'm going to convince you. And every day the giraffe goes on to describe the beauty of the world to the goat, the beauty of the mountains and how the sun rays, shine through the trees and through the rooftops and the trees and just the beautiful, beautiful scenery. And finally the goat's convinced. And the goat's like, okay, I'm going to try this. I'm going to try to look up to see what you're describing. And one, bright and sunny Tuesday morning, the goat works really hard, stands on its hind legs, holds on, climbs up, and looks. And the giraffe's like waiting, like, all right, can't wait to see his reaction. Like, what's he going to say when he sees all this beautiful stuff? And the goat says, but I can't eat any of this. And that was the end of the giraffe's very great effort in trying to get the goat to see the world differently. This parable is told to describe how we as people tend to get so wrapped up in our perceived reality, in our little bubbles, in our little world. It's very hard for us to look beyond that. It's very hard for us to see relevance in anything that's beyond this, little circle that we've gotten used to knowing and dealing with on a daily basis. And I know we've mentioned it in this class before that from the Tanya's perspective, the opposite of loving God and being passionate about Judaism is not hating God. What's the opposite of loving Judaism? Indifference, not caring. You see, the goat didn't want to look up, not because it hated looking up. The goat didn't want to look up because the goat kind of felt like this is irrelevant to my life. I just need my grass. I need to be able to eat, and that's it. Like nothing else really matters to me. And in Judaism, the opposite of being connected and being inspired is just not caring and saying, who cares? What does this matter to me? It's only when I start realizing that this might be relevant to my life and might be able to enrich my life that allows me to look at Judaism and to look at spirituality. And that's what the Tanya sets out to do. If you notice, the Tanya doesn't really teach us any grand, novel, new ideas that we've never heard before. Everything Tanya mentions are things that they're basic concepts in Judaism, the idea of a soul. In the beginning of Genesis, we're told that God blew a soul into Adam. So it's not like a soul, not like the Tanya invented the idea of the soul. But what the Tanya attempts to do is to take all of this spirituality, all of these concepts, and show us how they're relevant to our lives and how they actually can enrich our lives and allow us to live more connected, deeper, more meaningful lives. So that was, we mentioned last time in the opening introduction to the Tanya, it quotes that phrase of Ki karov elecha. The matter is very near to you. Moses tells the Jewish people, it's very near to you to be Jewish, to act Jewish, to do what God wants. You really could do it. It's not irrelevant. It's not somewhere, high up in the sky. And the Tanya aims to show us how is it. So we spent a lot of time talking about our soul and our soul powers and who we're trying to be. We're trying to be this, aspiring Benoni. And we spent the most recent chapters talking about what we might call the ideal Benoni. This person who serves God with all of their actions and emotions because they spend time meditating and arousing love, right? And we spoke about the connection between the mind and the heart. And the more I think about things, the more I could feel for them. And if I want to be the kind of person that really invests my full self into service of God, I need to spend time meditating and making it real to me and starting to really feel for God. And then I can love God with all my heart, the way we described in the Shema. Chapter 18 starts almost like a new section. Imagine someone goes to the doctor and says, I'm struggling with this, with that, the other, and the doctor prescribes a diet change, a lifestyle change. You need to exercise, you need to take these vitamins, you need to do X, Y, and Z. And it's going to take a good few months for you to get, where you're supposed to be. And the person says, fine, doctor, I'm committed. I'm going to take my vitamins. I'm going to exercise every day. I'm going to eat right. But I just need something that's going to work now. I'm going to keep doing this, but I can't wait 6 months to start feeling better. Can you give me some kind of like emergency medicine or some kind of painkiller or something I can take now until like the long process starts working? And the doctor says, well, the only real solution is the long-term solution. But I can give you some like quick tips and fixes that can help you, when you're in a pinch. That's a little bit what chapter 18 does. Chapter 18 begins by telling us that, yes, the ideal way to arouse love and emotional connection to God is through meditation. But we all know that for meditation to start really affecting us, it takes a long time. Even for someone who's studying Tanya, right? You don't study Tanya in one day and suddenly start looking at the world differently. After you've been studying Tanya for a while, suddenly you're like, hey, wait, I realize that I start looking at the world a little differently. It didn't happen overnight. So chapter 18 says, well, what if I want to serve God with love now, like right now? And all of this meditation and studying is going to take time. Is there anything else I can do to arouse that love inside me? And chapter 18 says, yes, there is a shortcut. It's a quick fix. It's not intended to use on a regular basis, and you're going to see why. But there is something that you can tap into that will allow you to connect to God in a real loving and emotionally strong way without going through all that meditation. And that's one of our soul's secret soul powers, right? What did I write in the email? Like the secret powers that we didn't know our soul has. A good story to introduce this is there's a group of hikers who are trying to get to the top of a mountain. Now, this mountain is known to be very, very difficult to climb. And so they train for weeks and they get all the right gear and the right clothes and they read all the books and they finally start their journey and they're slowly but surely, making their way higher and higher up the mountain. And finally, after months of training and weeks of climbing, they make it to the summit. And as they're like starting to feel good about, okay, yay, we made it, they look around and they see a kid like jumping around on the top of the mountain like it's nobody's business. They're like, well, one second. Do you realize that we're adults who worked really, really, really hard to get here, and there are people who don't even make it here. Like, how are you, 3-year-old child, just so casually and freely bouncing around the top of the mountain? And what does the child say? Well, actually, I was born here. Chapter 18 is letting us know that there is a part of our soul that was born on the top of the mountain. There is some part of our soul that we can tap into that doesn't require, yes, there's a part that requires intense meditation and contemplation to really connect emotionally. There's also that part of us that's already so deeply connected. And if only we can tap into it, we can connect instantly. What is that part of our soul? Now, before we see what the Tanya says inside, it's an interesting discussion because a lot of people feel uncomfortable talking about the Jewish soul potentially being any different than anyone else's soul. I know a lot of times when I teach Tanya and the Tanya says, well, the Jewish soul is a godly spark. And they're like, well, what about everyone else's soul? Yes, every human being was created in the image of God and everyone has a soul. But somehow Jews specifically are very uncomfortable talking about the fact that Jews may be different. So before we get into what the Tanya says, I thought it would be interesting to look at, let's not look at Jews. Let's see what non-Jews have had to say about Jews throughout history. Somehow, when non-Jews look at Jews, they see that we're different. They see us as different. Again, not necessarily better, but different. They see that there's something unique about us. Maybe it's part of what's unique about us is that we can't handle saying it about ourselves. It's not something we can gloat about or be proud of because it's nothing we ever did or earned. But there is something unique about being Jewish. I want to share a few slides with you of, quotes of famous people, non-Jews, who have said things about the Jewish people, just to put things a little bit into perspective. Let me see if I can share this. Second. All right, we'll start with this quote from John Adams, the second U.S. president. Here's what John Adams said. I will insist that the Hebrews have contributed more to civilized men than any other nation. If I was an atheist and believed in blind eternal fate, I should still believe that fate has ordained the Jews to be the most essential instrument for civilizing the nations. They are the most glorious nation that ever inhabited this earth. The Romans and their empire were but a bubble in comparison to the Jews. They have given religion to 3/4 of the globe and have influenced the affairs of mankind more and more happily than any other nation, ancient or modern. The next quote, I actually meant to look up who this guy is. Maybe someone here knows and chime in if you do. But this is also a famous historian, I think. One of the gifts of the Jewish culture to Christianity is that it has taught Christians to think like Jews. And any modern man who has not learned to think as though he were a Jew can hardly be said to have learned to think at all. Not my words, his. This one is from Paul Johnson, an American historian. The Jewish vision became the prototype for many similar grand designs for humanity, both divine and man-made. The Jews, therefore, stand at the center of the perennial attempt to give human life the dignity of a purpose. Famous British poet Matthew Arnold. As long as the world lasts, all who want to make progress in righteousness will come to Israel. I don't think he means literally the land of Israel, more like the people of Israel, for inspiration as to the people who had the sense for righteousness most glowing and strongest. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, German writer and statesman. Every Jew, no matter how insignificant, is engaged in some decisive and immediate pursuit of a goal. It is the most perpetual people of the earth. And we'll end with this most famous one. Sorry that it's so small. Let me see if I can make it bigger. The famous quote from Mark Twain. Let me see if I can uncover it here. I'll read it out loud in case you can't see the words. If the statistics are right, the Jews constitute but 1/4% of the human race. It suggests a nebulous puff of stardust lost in the blaze of the Milky Way. Properly, The Jew ought to hardly have been heard of, but he is heard of, has always been heard of. He is as prominent on the planet as any other people, and his importance is extravagantly out of proportion to the smallness of his bulk. His contributions to the world's list of great names in literature, science, art, music, finance, medicine, and abstruse learning are also very out of proportion to the weakness of his numbers. He has made a marvelous fight in this world in all ages, and has done it with his hands tied behind him. He could be vain of himself and excused for it. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, and the Persians filled the planet. They rose. They filled the planet with sound and splendor, then faded to dream stuff and passed away. The Greeks and Romans followed and made a vast noise, and they were gone. Other people have sprung up and held their torch high for a time, but it burnt out, and they sit in twilight now and have vanished. The Jew saw them all, survived them all. And now what he always was, and is now what he always was, exhibiting no decadence, no infirmities of age, no weakening of his parts, no slowing of his energies, no dulling of his alert but aggressive mind. All things are mortal but the Jews. All other forces pass, but he remains. What is the secret of his immortality? This is from Mark Twain in 1897. The reason I bring these before we talk about the way that Tanya describes the Jews is the Torah, when the Torah calls us the chosen people, we're not called the chosen people because we're better than everyone else. God tells us clearly, I created all people in my image. All people in the world have a responsibility to make the world a good place and a better place. I have given the Jews a very specific mission in this world. And Kabbalah teaches us that in order for the Jews to fulfill their unique mission, they have a uniquely Jewish soul. And the reason I bring these quotes is that sometimes it's easier to hear it from others and to hear it from ourselves. Apparently, other nations of the world see us as different. Anti-Semitism doesn't come because they think we're just like them. They know there's something different about us. It might make them hate us, but there's something about us that makes us different. So from the Kabbalistic perspective, what is that? What makes us different? What makes a Jew a Jew? We already know from so many discussions, it's not what we believe, because we have plenty of atheist Jews who are still just as Jewish as you and I. It's not how much we learn. It's not, what political side of the spectrum we're on. It's not how successful we are. There's something about Jews that kind of transcends everything else. It's not about our language. It's not about where we live. It's not about what we do. So what is it? And Kabbalah teaches us that it's the Jewish soul. It's a unique spiritual type that we have. It's a spiritual makeup that we have that makes us who we are. And here the Tanya points out and says, what you should know about your spiritual makeup, something unique about the spiritual makeup, is that we have inside of our soul something that the Tanya calls ahava mesuteret. There is a hidden love. There is something inside of us that loves God and is connected to God on a very, very deep level. It's called hidden because we're often not aware of it. And the Tanya tells us that even the most atheist Jew, even the person who will deny everything about Judaism, the Jewishness inside them doesn't change. And very deep down, a Jew cannot essentially be disconnected from God. The fact that we have this godly soul, this godly spark, means that there's a piece of us that's already born on top of the mountain. Again, we may not recognize it, we may deny it, but it exists deep inside of us. And that's the part of us that we're going to want to figure out how to activate in order to access this hidden love when I need a quick fix. I want to talk about this.
Can I ask you a question about that, Jeannie?
Yes, of course.
Okay. So I've talked to people that have used the expression, I'm a bagels and lox Jew. Like, and they say it almost like a badge of honor, right? And so, but they very much are involved in the Jewish community. It means so much to them. So, how, if there's no, I'm trying to say this PC, if there's no like religious connection, no spiritual connection, but they like the food and they like the parties and they like being Jewish and being a part of the Jewish community, is that part of them? What's driving them to be with other Jews? Like I'm trying to figure out like what is driving you
What's the
if you
practical
feel no
implication?
real, yeah, if you feel no real connection with, like tonight, there's this, I don't know if you guys saw it, but there was this purple pink sunset here. And I just sat there, my eyes filled with tears, and I was like, thank you, God. I so needed that hug. Like, I mean, I see it everywhere. But then someone who's more involved in the Jewish community, the Dallas Jewish community, has no connection to God. So it's very interesting to me. I'm trying to figure out what you're saying versus what I've kind of observed. And I'm going to be quiet and listen.
So, no, I'm happy that you're asking all these questions. The Tanya actually is going to spend the next few chapters discussing this hidden love, because while we say, it's funny because what we described as the long way to bring up emotion, to awaken emotion for God, the Tanya describes in one or two chapters. And here, what the Tanya is going to describe as the quick fix actually takes us about 5 or 6 chapters to describe. So it's a quick fix that we can tap into easily, but it's not necessarily very simple to describe, and it does take time to really explain what is this, where does it come from, what are the practical ramifications of it. In short, if I were to give you an overview of practically what does it mean for a Jew to have this hidden love, there are two elements. Firstly, a Jew has, the Tanya explains, an innate faith. Deep down, the Jew has a faith that can be compared to something that you believe because you've seen it. Once you've seen something, you can't unsee it. There's a part of you that remembers seeing that thing. Now, you can consciously forget about it. You can rationalize it and convince yourself that it's not true. You can get busy with other things. But when push comes to shove and you're put in a tight spot, you're going to remember what you really saw. And that's one way to explain what is this that our soul has. If a Jew has a soul that is a piece of God, that means there's a part of me that knows God to be true. Now, again, I can cover up on it by rationalizing, getting busy with other things, so many ways that we can cover up on it so we don't feel it on a daily basis. But deep down, it exists. And one of the ways that the Tanya brings as proof of its existence is something that you see in the Jewish people that you don't see in any other group. And I know we've mentioned this, Tanya, before, but that is the concept of um, being willing to give one's life, to give up one's life for God without any benefit to self. Now, to be fair, there are people who will give up their life for their belief, not Jewish, right? Some crazy person last year who burnt themselves alive for the Palestinian cause and made sure to have, it was a horrible story, but you can say, hey, that person just, gave up their life for something they believe in. That's true, but there was a very clear benefit. They gave up their life because they were trying to convince people of something being true. It's only in Jewish people that you see that a Jewish person who's faced with the choice, are you willing to convert or you're going to be killed? And you'll still have the Jews say, I'd rather be killed as a Jew than convert. That is something, it's not going to bring them any fame. It's not going to convince anyone of what they believe. It's purely for no benefit to themselves other than I don't want to be disconnected from God. Now, there are so many stories. I know we mentioned them in this class before, and they're always worth, bringing up again. So many stories of Jews who, like Lorraine described, could have been self-described bagels and lox Jews, or even worse, atheist Jews, Jews who say, I don't believe, this stuff is ridiculous and it's crazy. But when they're put in a corner and they're in a tough spot, they are willing to give up their lives for God. I mean, we don't even have to look, usually I tell stories of, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, the Holocaust. We don't have to look any further back than the last 2 months. So many of the hostage stories that are coming out of hostages who were released, who you listen to the interviews and it's mind blowing. You have hostages who, in their interview, they explain, I never believed in God. I never said Shema Yisrael in my life. This is one of the male hostages described. He says, I never said it. I never spoke about God in my life. I never believed. He said, I can't explain it to you that as soon as I'm in this miserable situation and I see what I'm faced with, and I know that I'm being singled out because I'm a Jew, it just awakens something inside me. Now, you might say that for some of these, you might try to explain that someone tapping into faith is a way of giving themselves hope. That's sometimes the case. If someone's a very difficult situation and maybe connecting to faith will give them hope. But you also see in some situations where it wasn't giving them any hope, it actually made their life more miserable. For example, I'm pretty sure we mentioned the story here before, but one of the young women who were just released, Agam Berger, again, she was someone who never practiced any form of Judaism. She was just Israeli, and it's for us Americans, it's hard to understand, but I feel like in Israel is where you see the strongest contrast, where you see people who are, 100% Israeli and Jewish, and yet at the same time, they really, really, you know, distance themselves from any sort of faith or belief in God or anything religious. This girl, Agam, was in captivity. The terrorists appointed her to be their cook. She knew how to cook. She was going to be the cook. She says, I mean, her friends all said this about her. When she was in captivity, she decided that actually, if I'm put here because I'm Jewish, I'm going to connect Jewishly. I'm going to start keeping Shabbat. And on Shabbat, the terrorists told her that you have to cook us, whatever they commanded her to cook for them. And she stood up to them and said, no, you can kill me if you want to. I will not cook on Shabbat. Say, what? Like, where does someone get the audacity to say that? I mean, we're talking about Hamas terrorists. We saw what they did. She knew what they could have done to her in a split second. And yet, not coming from a religious background, not coming from a Jewish upbringing, where does she get the power to say, I'd rather die as a Jew than do what you want? I mean, the Yarden Bibas, the husband of the woman who was killed, we're all familiar with the story of the Bibas family and the children. He said as well, he said at some point he went through some serious physical and psychological torture by his captors. At some point they told him, we're willing to lessen your torture if you'll convert to Islam. And he said he didn't even have to think. He said, absolutely not. And again, if you ask him, he's a self-described secular Jew who doesn't believe in anything and doesn't do any of this stuff. Why? I mean, they were literally torturing him. Why would he not agree to at least say, I'll convert? Who cares? Doesn't matter anyway. Who knows if I'm getting out of this hellhole? At least they'll stop torturing me. That's where you see that hidden love, that deep, deep spark of godliness that's so deep inside of us, we're not typically aware of it, but when push comes to shove, it wakes up. And another fascinating thing that you see about Jews who give up their lives for God is it's specifically not necessarily the religious ones, not necessarily the learned ones, not necessarily the ones who are so committed to the faith. It's any Jew. I mean, we've mentioned a few times here the story of Daniel Pearl. Again, Daniel Pearl was, I mean, it's hard to give titles to a Jew, but if you just look at his life, he was not Jewishly connected or affiliated. He was married to a non-Jew. He was not living his life in any Jewish way. And yet, when his captors wanted to murder him on camera, he decided to make a statement. I was born a Jew. My mother's a Jew. My father's a Jew. I'm a Jew. I'm going to die a Jew. Where does that come from? You don't see that in any other people. The Tanya says, when you see these stories, you are seeing what the term that's used for it is the pintala yid. To anyone who speaks Yiddish, pintala is a point, and yid is Yiddish for Jew. That like dot of Jew inside you. So yes, even someone who will describe themselves as whatever kind of Jew you want. But as soon as their Jewishness is threatened in some way, most likely they will they'll stand up for Jewishness. They'll stand up for God. There was a story, I don't remember the details exactly, but I believe in the early 90s, there was a group of Israelis um, who were in some Muslim country, and they were I should really pull up the story, the details before I share these stories, but it's a group of Israelis who were traveling and they were captured. And while they were traveling, there was one of them who was what he described himself as a religious Jew. You know, he believed in God, he kept some basic level of Shabbat and Kashrut, but his friends didn't. And he said their entire trip they would argue over like religion things. And one of his friends would like make fun of him all the time. Like, what do you believe in this stuff? You know, I don't believe it. It's so outdated. It's not connected to me. You know, even if someone were to offer me to convert to another religion, I would do that in a second. Like, I don't care for this stuff. In the end, they were captured, and sadly, um, all of them were murdered except for the religious one. When he came back and he shared the stories of their experiences, he said that he was mind blown when he saw that his atheist friend, who was very antagonistic to anything Jewish, when the captors offered him, they said, "We'll let you live if you denounce your Judaism." He said, "No, I'm going to die as a Jew." And he's like, "What? Didn't you just tell me that you would never do that?" But it's something, it's hard to describe, but it's something that's deep inside of us that sadly gets awakened when we're under very tough circumstances. It's not something that, wakes up just on a random Monday. Yes, Arlene.
When you're talking about this, it brings to my mind the Spanish Inquisition, where you had Jews who did convert, albeit perhaps in secret. They kept up their Jewish traditions, but they did on the surface convert. I just wanted to bring that up and ask you about that.
So I'm so happy that you said that. And I should clarify, it is not to make a statement that any Jew who's ever offered to convert will refuse to convert. That's throughout history, there have been Jews who converted out. Even literally, I just met a student last week who was telling me about his sister, who it sad to think in 2025, but her non-Jewish husband really wanted her to convert, and he was trying to understand if she's still Jewish because she's officially converted to Christianity for her husband. So yes, there are Jews, sadly, who choose to convert, and there have been Jews who, under some kind of threat, did choose to convert. I think we're talking about a pattern that we see, that by and large, there's a huge percentage that will resist. And you won't see that in any other people or in any other religion. And even those who, let's say, during the Spanish Inquisition, right, those who did choose to convert, it's because they convinced themselves that this is just a pretense. I'm really keeping, later there were horrible names given to them, and there were people who really were upset with them, but they felt that they can keep their Judaism in secret in their cellars and outwardly act as if they converted just to save themselves and their families. So yes, you're right. It's not to say that it will never happen, but by and large, you just see so many Jews who will stand up and refuse to give up their Judaism. Now, it's interesting. Sometimes we like to think that maybe in previous generations they were more Jewish than us, Our grandparents, our great-grandparents, they were all more Jewish than us. Somehow now we're not so Jewish.
Put a hand up.
I mean, according to this, I feel like we can say that maybe in previous generations, Jews were just more triggered than us. They were more hunted down for being Jewish than us. See, one thing that our enemies haven't yet figured out, they're so desperate to get rid of us, and anti-Semitism is so strong. What they haven't realized is that the easiest way to get rid of the Jews is just to leave them alone and let them assimilate. Because when we're left alone and no one's threatening us, that's when Jews, by and large, just lose touch with their Judaism. I mean, we've all seen in the last year and a half since October 7th how many Jews have suddenly awakened about their Judaism, something we've never seen before. Why is that? suddenly being Jewish like came under threat, and suddenly, everybody's waking up. There's actually a very interesting an interesting piece of history in the I believe it's in the early 1800s when the the czars were ruling Russia and Napoleon wanted to conquer Russia. Most of the Jewish leaders at the time were really hoping that Napoleon would win because Napoleon promised, democracy and freedom and was going to make the life of the Jews much easier. The author of the Tanya, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, who was a Jewish leader at the time, he actually really, really, really did not want Napoleon to win, to the extent that it said that he actually sent his own followers to be spies for the Tsar against Napoleon. If you think like he was a Jewish leader, why didn't he want just freedom and democracy for the Jewish people? Why was he happier for them to live under the Tsar, which was pretty difficult for the Jews? And he says, I know the people. I know that if Napoleon's going to win and there's going to be this, tremendous freedom, it's going to lead directly to assimilation and the Jews are going to be gone. The only way the Jews are going to retain their Jewish identity if there's constantly a threat from the outside. It's a sad reality, but we see it. I mean, look at the different countries around the world. See which ones have, overall less assimilation and stronger Jewish identity. It's usually the ones where being Jewish is not easy. Because where being Jewish is easy and we have so much freedom and you could be Jewish as you want, if you want, when you want, no one will bother you, we lose touch with that part of us and it becomes very easy to forget. Now, again, not to wish difficulty upon any Jews, God forbid. We want only good and only peace, but it's a reality that you can't ignore. This is the nature of the Jewish people. There's a part of us that wakes up when we're under threat. Yes, Barbara. Oh, I see Harry. I guess you'll go after Barbara.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, so if if the Jewish soul has this special connection to God, what happens to that same Jewish soul if they convert?
If they?
If the Jew converts, I mean, they have this Jewish soul and it's connected to God in this Jewish way, whatever that means. What happens to that Jewish neshama when they convert, if and when they convert?
You know what happens? Nothing
No.
happens. They remain as Jewish as they ever were. From the Jewish perspective, a Jew cannot change their Jewish identity. There's no way to renounce your Judaism.
Okay, so it can't be done.
It can't be done. I mean, if people think they do it, there have been people who have, gone through the conversion process and thought they've, changed. And there's actually some fascinating stories about Jews who, went through this process and then at some point that Pintele Yid woke up again. Something happened and suddenly they woke up. I'm trying to think of the details of this. There's a story, a very fascinating story in the Talmud during the times of the Hanukkah story. I don't want to misquote it, but there was a young woman from I believe she was from the priestly family, that I guess the equivalent then of what today would be assimilated. She married one of the Greek generals and she completely, left her people and went against the Jewish people. And the Talmud describes a scene where she was in Jerusalem and she saw when the Greeks defiled the temple and she saw that they placed a pig on the altar. And she came over to the altar and she cried out, God, how could you do this to your people? I say, whoa, wait a second. This woman just married a Greek general. That's like the equivalent of a Jewish woman marrying a Nazi. And then saying, God, how do you allow the Nazis to murder the Jews? And it's a very fascinating story, and Hasidic teachings really delve into it. But what lies at the heart of the story is exactly what you mentioned, Barbara. Somebody who they left their faith, they rebelled against their people, and still somehow she's watching her people being destroyed, and something tugs at her. And she's like, God, how can you allow this? God, like you believe in God, you know? But yeah, apparently there's a piece of her that still really believed and still really was deeply connected, even if consciously she wasn't aware of it. Now, the Tanya describes this as something that we receive as an inheritance. You know, it's interesting because when people studied this years ago, I believe it was probably harder to understand than now. Say, okay, what's a spiritual inheritance? You know, we know genetics. We know how physical genetics affect us that we get from our parents, but how could there be spiritual genetics? And I feel like I wonder if today it might be a little easier to explain. Today there's a lot of talk about generational trauma. You know, things that get passed down because previous generations went through trauma and something of that was transmitted to their children. It's not something you could point to in anyone's DNA. We still can't fully figure out how it transfers, but somehow it does transfer. There's talk about emotions of parents that affect children, right? A woman who went through tremendous anxiety during pregnancy, there could be real ramifications on her unborn child. Again, we can't explain what it is, but we know that there's some kind of emotional genetics that pass down. Along those lines, the Tanya says there's also spiritual genetics. When you get a Jewish soul, it comes with, this is part and parcel of getting a Jewish soul. It's a spiritual genetic condition that you have this spark of God inside you that has an innate hidden love. I want to read a little bit of the Tanya inside. I think Harriet wants to say something first.
Yeah, my question was probably the flip side of Barbara's, and that is that there have been an increase, at least in Reform and conservative synagogues, of people wanting to convert to Judaism, more so a significant increase after October 7th. And wondering if it tapped into a Jewish soul, or, I mean, instead of people running away from danger, it's people running to that. And I was curious about what you saw in terms of, talking about Jewish soul. Is it possible that these people way back somewhere that they may not have even been aware that have some Jewish ancestry? I mean, how do you explain that?
Okay, so that's a good question. There are a few things. There is a possibility that this person, really is Jewish, has, and there are fascinating stories about people who, were really wanted to convert to Judaism, and then they found out that they were actually Jewish and they didn't know. There's also a concept not directly related to this, but when the Torah talks about conversion, the Torah uses very interesting language. It says, Ger shenit gayer, a convert who wants to convert. This is the process. You say, wait a second, a convert who wants to convert? You mean a non-Jew who wants to convert? Why does the Torah call a convert even before they choose to convert? It says they're already a convert who comes to convert. And the commentaries explain that someone who chooses to convert, they already have that potential soul. There is a soul element that's driving them to convert. So there is, something spiritual going on where they are somehow, I wouldn't say that they have the Jewish soul, but they have some connection to a Jewish soul that's driving them to want to go through with this process. But at the same time, I will also say that it's, when people ask, why does Judaism, specifically traditional Judaism, make it so difficult and complicated to convert? Like, why they make such a difficult process? Like, and there have been groups that have tried to make the process easier and lighter and quicker. And why don't we just let them in if they want to? When you understand the complexity of a Jewish soul and the uniqueness of a Jewish soul, and if I say this is your spiritual DNA, don't you think it should be pretty difficult to acquire spiritual DNA? Like, I can't acquire a new spiritual DNA by just taking a course and signing the dotted line. The Torah says you could. You're welcome in. You want to convert, we accept converts. But there's a very unique formula for adopting this spiritual makeup. And you can't just make it up. The God prescribes a very specific way. If you follow this way, you're in. You don't follow this way, it's like, it's very nice that you want to be part of it, but you can't actually acquire a soul that's a godly soul if you're not following God's rules for how to acquire that soul. That's a, a separate long discussion. I wanted to just look, I don't know if we have time to look inside the Tanya. Maybe we'll continue that next time. But I want to get to the point of the Tanya, that we're talking about this hidden love that we have. What about the hidden love? We talk sometimes about adrenaline that we all have that comes out in certain circumstances, right? There's the famous story of the woman who's watching her child being run over by a car. And what does she do? She runs over and lifts up the car, saves her child's life. How did this woman manage to do it? 100-pound woman who doesn't lift weights. Like, how did she lift a car? And what do we say? Adrenaline. Like, there is that rush of adrenaline that just allows her to do incredible things under duress. Imagine the next day, someone calls up this woman and says, hey, Sarah, gosh, I heard what happened yesterday. Actually, I just ordered a new washing machine and I'm trying to take my old washing machine from the basement and, move it to my attic so that I can make room for the new washing machine. Since you're able to lift up a car, can you come over and lift my washing machine for me and bring it upstairs to the attic? What do you say? I mean, if she wants to, she still cannot lift it up, right? Why is it that yesterday she was able to lift it up and today she can't? Because that adrenaline gets activated during a time of duress. There's certain circumstances that trigger this rush of adrenaline. Similarly, the Tanya is going to say that this hidden love that's inside of us gets triggered in stressful situations. It gets triggered when I feel like my connection to God is at stake. When I feel like I'm about to lose my connection. So for many people, that is when they're told to give up their Judaism. For some people, it could be other things that like trigger them to, no, I'm not going to do that no matter what it takes. When I feel like my Judaism is at risk, suddenly that hidden love pops out. So the Tanya says, well, if I know that I have this innate love for God, and I know that it could be awakened in a time of difficulty, why do I wait for a sword to be at my neck? Let me figure out how to create the circumstances to awaken this love on a regular Wednesday afternoon. When I want to serve God with love, and I don't have the time to do all those long meditations, or I haven't yet learned enough to get there, but I want to have passionate love for God. Tanya says, guess what? What's the expression? In an emergency, like break glass. If you're in a situation where you really need to wake up emotion for Judaism, and you're not able to get it in the typical long meditative kind of way, there's a quick fix. Awaken your hidden love. How are you going to awaken your hidden love? I think we're going to have to get to that next time. But the short answer is that you have to create the circumstances in your own mind where you realize that this too can be an emergency. Meaning, if I were in a situation, if I know that if someone, God forbid, held a gun to my head and told me convert or die, I would rather die than convert because I really love God so much I don't want to be disconnected. Then if I am faced with doing a mitzvah and I'm having a hard time awakening passion, perhaps I can create the scenario in my own mind that will make me feel like this too is threatening my connection. I don't want to be disconnected. I have the opportunity to maintain my connection with God right now. And guess what? I don't even have to die for it. I just have to tap into this part of me. And again, it's hard to explain on one foot, and the Tanya is going to keep describing it for the next few chapters, but the Tanya tells us it is possible through following a certain thought process for us to tap into this love and awaken it even when our lives are not threatened, even when we're just trying to create more emotion in our service of God. In other words, I would say the Tanya seems to be telling us, challenge yourself to be more Jewish because you already are. You know, stop thinking I'm not there. I can't get there. That's not me. I'm not learned enough. I'm not knowledgeable enough. I don't do enough. There's a part of you that's already there. There is a part of you that was born on top of the mountain and is already so deeply connected. You just have to figure out how to tap into that part of you. And so you don't have to wait until. You can do it now just by tapping into who you already are and what you already have. Another thought that connects to this is, you know, when we talk about faith, right? I want to continue this chapter next time because the Tanya in this chapter continues to analyze what is this love? Like, where is it? How, you know, where does it exist inside of us exactly? And how does it express itself? And if we go back to the quotes that we quoted from all those non-Jews talking about the Jews, if you had to find a common denominator to all of them, like what are they all saying? You know, one of them is saying how the Jews brought morality to the world. And one of them is saying how the Jews brought knowledge of God to the world. And they're each saying different things, but in essence, they're all saying something very similar. They're all saying that the Jews have brought something transcendent to the world. There's something about the Jewish way of thinking, the Jewish way of doing things that transcends our reality. We're like open to a certain higher reality. You know, it's interesting talking about this hidden love that exists in a Jew. You'll find many Jews who might describe themselves, let's say, as bagels and lox Jews and don't connect to anything Jewish, but they're still really, really involved in trying to make the world a better place. They might be super into saving the whales. They might be super into, you know, politics of any sort. Whatever, it's a joke because it's almost like a religion to them, but they're not religious. But they have something that they hang on to that they're desperately trying to make the world a better place. You could see that also as a reflection of their innate Jewishness. There's that drive inside of them that just wants to connect, just wants to do something big, just wants to transcend, but doesn't know how to get there. So they can channel it in many ways. The Tanya tells us that, you know, our soul is deep inside yearning for something. And that yearning must be expressed. And if my soul doesn't manage to express it in the way the soul wants, it's going to drive us crazy. And we could lead our lives constantly searching and not knowing what we're searching for. And when a Jew is searching and yearning, they think they're searching for meaning, they're searching for connection. They'll try this, they'll try that. A Jew will never really be satisfied with any of these things that they find. They'll get into saving the whales, they'll find a certain amount of fulfillment from that, and then they'll say, there's still something more. You know, they'll get into some program, some politics, some, you know, movement. There's something inside them that's searching. And very often, because it's a hidden love, they're not even aware of what they're searching for. But the truth is that it's that divine spark inside of them that's yearning for connection. They're just not aware of what it is that they're yearning for and what they're searching for. Well, there's so many stories of Jews who went to Buddhism and went to all these other Eastern religions and other religions. And finally, when they came to Judaism, they're like, oh, no one ever told me this is all, you know, I can find it all in Judaism. There's something in them that was searching and that will continue to search until their soul gets what it really wants. And what our soul really wants is to be connected to its source. So the godly soul knows where it comes from. It knows it's a piece of God. So, you know, it is 9 o'clock and I want to end, but, you know, we are in the middle of chapter 18. I will sum up to say that what we've basically said is that the Tanya teaches us there is something unique about a Jewish soul. The uniqueness of a Jewish soul is that it has a certain drive, a certain restlessness, a certain yearning for connection, even if we don't feel it on a regular basis. It typically gets activated, you know, in the open under duress, although it may be driving other decisions in our lives without us actually realizing it. I think next class we'll spend time on the rest of the chapter trying to really understand how does this soul operate? How do we actually tap into it? And how do we utilize it in our day-to-day lives and not, you know, God willing, nobody should ever be faced with a situation where they have to, you know, decide if they're going to convert or die, right? But how do we utilize this deep love that we know we have without being faced with these actual, real, you know, external threats? Actually, next week I will not be available. My daughter has a production that she is part of next week on Monday night. So I will not be here, but we will pick up the following Monday, God willing. Thoughts, questions, feel free to stay on. If you have to go, feel free to sign off. Happy to chat. Yes, Arlene.
I just want to say that I think you presented this beautifully, very, very effectively, and just really.
Thank you. I'm happy. You know, it's a very, for someone who's not exposed to it or someone who hasn't really studied it before, it comes off as a very extreme concept. And sometimes people, and I've met people who get very offended by it. Like I recently spoke to someone who said, you know, I was told not to study Tanya because the Tanya says that Jews are different than everyone else. It's like, you know, I get it. You know, I'm sorry that you find that offensive, but if there's nothing different about being Jewish, then what does being Jewish even mean?
Yeah.
Right? If there, you have to recognize, and I think it would be different if we said that perhaps Jews are better. It's not. Everyone's created for a unique purpose, a unique mission, and Jews have a very unique mission. So yeah, it definitely is not a popular topic, so to speak, but a very interesting topic that the Tanya brings up, and so much of the Tanya's teachings circle back to this. Just imagine the comfort of knowing that there's a part of the part of me that's as Jewish as Moses, and nothing that I can do can ever take it away. Like it's almost like no matter how bad I act, no matter how off the deep end I go, there's a part of me that's still on top of the mountain. Which is, it's fascinating because that also explains later the Tanya's whole premise on Teshuvah. That, you know, some people think Teshuvah, I need to transform myself. I need to become. No, you don't have to. You just have to tap into what your true essence really is. And once you tap into that, you're there. Like you're already connected. You just have to recognize it. Thank you, Arlene. Anyone else? Thoughts, questions, comments?
Good night.
Have a good night. Have a wonderful week. We'll be in touch.
Thank you so much, Danny.
You, Deanie.
Sure, thank you.
Thank